Gideon Singer, Solutions Engineer at Carto. Welcome on the Geospatial Index.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I see you've got a University of South Australia hoodie there. Tell us, where'd you get that from?
Yeah, when I was in graduate school, I formed a relationship with a center at UniSA focused on zero waste. And they did a great conference called Unmaking Waste. I tried to go there when I got a Fulbright to study in Australia during my doctorate. That center kind of shifted its focus, so I ended up at the Appleton Institute, which is part of Central Queensland University. But nevertheless, I spent a lot of time living in Adelaide during my PhD fieldwork and had a great time there. And actually, under this, I've got a furry shirt for Little Bang and Stepney, just one of the suburbs outside of CBD there. And yeah, that's probably it's a part of my identity. The years I spent living in South Australia and the Territory.
Yeah, it was so nice to find out about all these things. We actually met, for the benefit of listeners, at Priscilla Cole's epic Geospatial Risk Summit in the past month in New York City. So yeah, it was amazing to come across you, knowing so much about where I'm from. So yeah, it's great to connect
Yeah,
again.
it was fun to talk. You don't meet a lot of folks from Radelaide, this
Adelaide,
side of the world. Yeah.
SA, it's heaps good. That's
Oh
another
yeah.
phrase. Cool. Okay, so yeah, once again, it's amazing to have you on. I really liked the idea of deliberately in this episode stepping through some of the culture and power dimensions and dynamics of geospatial. You've already mentioned rubbish and the study of or rather digital garbology. So that's one of the later agenda items. But yeah, glad that you're flagging what we'll get into already. So I think first cab off the rank is a network accessibility analysis that you've been working on. Could you step us through
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, sure. So as I work with spatial data, really across multiple different industries, um, as of mind as of late has been telco, and it's just thinking how can telco companies take the issue of accessibility seriously and use different data sets to sort of enrich their understanding of where they can go to meet communities where the need is. And so I've been putting together a dashboard with some work from a colleague of mine, and I will share my screen. Essentially, if you can see this map, we've got a map of the entire United States, which is quite a bit of data. And each area of the US is scored on a network accessibility score. And the impetus for this was taking that analytical output, which can be done completely in the cloud, using a data warehouse to do a lot of the heavy lifting for the data analysis, and bring it into Carto, which is a data visualization platform, and put this in the hands of a prospective telco customer and say, you know, let's together explore which areas around the country have the highest need and which areas might actually also be eligible for funding. And so the first thing I'm going to do, if I was, guiding you through this dashboard, is take all of this data, send a query back to the database and say, only show me the areas of the country that are eligible for funding, because if they're not, there's not much I can do about it right now. Um, and uh, I happen to know that you live in the Atlanta area, so I'm gonna drill this
Yes, you
map
can
down to
immediately recognize it from these building footprints, of course.
exactly.
But we
So
are
that map
geospatial.
behind you looks different than the one that I have on the screen here, which actually has a lot of areas that are turned off because they're not eligible for funding, likely because they already have reasonable telco access or network
So are
access.
you talking about wireless and fiber and copper and all forms of telecommunication infrastructure, or is it only one sort?
Yeah, it's evaluated. That's a great question. It's evaluated against just the average download speeds, which
Okay.
takes into account, whether you have 5G access, fiber, fixed broadband, and things like that. And of course, what we're doing here is leveraging data from the FCC, so a massive national data set that has been spatially indexed, which is a little bit of buzzword in geospatial, but spatial indexing is what makes it possible to do this level of analysis so sort of quickly and painlessly. I'm going to actually drill out a little bit further and show you that it's going to recalculate all of those quad bins for the new area pretty quickly. And what I have here is all
You'll
these
you'll
different
have. I'm
cores.
sorry. I'm going to rudely
Yeah.
interrupt
Oh,
to
please
try
do.
to keep everybody coming along with us. So you mentioned a quad bin. You mentioned spatial indexing.
Uh-huh.
If we could have a sentence or two on each one.
Yeah. Okay. So quad bin is a type of spatial index. Spatial indexing is taking a geographic place and instead of associating coordinates with it, so sort of a polygon or point on the map, you are taking a known sort of table of places and saying that place matches that row on a table. And by doing sort of a standard table lookup, you can interact with that data much more quickly. And the spatial index that powers, for example, a quad bin, which is in this case a square on the map, whereas others might use H3, which is a hexagon. Um, by using those, when you zoom in and out of a map, the database is just pulling rows from a table. It's not having to pull complex geometries. And so really the simple benefit is when you're loading massive amount of data, you don't have to load all of the coordinates that are associated with them as well. And so in the US, for example, and we're looking at Atlanta here, one of the things that I did to power this map is instead of using polygons for core-based statistical areas or metropolitan zones, I spatially indexed the core-based statistical areas as well. So if I want to focus on Gainesville, Georgia, for example, which had the highest score on the map that we can see right now, it's able to filter that geometry very quickly and give us only the data from it. And the reason it's able to do it so quickly is because I, in advance, spatially indexed all of the data with which core statistical area that quad bin is within. Otherwise, and I've done this, and I'm sure other folks in geospatial have done this, if you start spatially filtering data by complex polygons, your app performance goes way down.
Yeah.
um,
It's great
and
to have someone speaking about this on the podcast, and it seems like a key skill for nice, responsive, engaging geospatial apps.
yeah, I think so. And half of the I think work behind geospatial is being an expert on how to get the most out of geospatial data, right? And there's a lot of different ways to get to the same endpoint. For example, the score for this core-based statistical area, you could get to it in a number of ways without even having to visualize it in this way. But one of the perks or benefits of visualizing with a spatial index is I'm not losing detail within the core-based statistical area. I can see that even though we're scoring 3.69 here, and if I click on the map, I'll get a little breakdown of what it means. So we have AI generated labels because Carto has the ability to connect with whichever AI tools your data warehouse use. So if you're in BigQuery, it'll use Gemini. If you're in an Azure-based one, it'll use an Azure-based AI language model and things like that. And so we get this resolution of data and insight without the expense of taking forever and ever and ever to load it if we were using complex geometries.
Okay, so we got a color ramp here from, was it light blue or blue essentially to red. So
Mm-hmm.
tell us about what this color ramp means and what decisions could be made based on it.
Yeah. So the color ramp is based on these scores, which range from 1 to 5. And one of the things that we have at Carto that I think is fun for our dashboards is the ability to add markdown language to our maps. And so, I'll actually be writing a blog post about this map, and we'll maybe by the time this episode comes out, we compare those two together. But
Definitely.
great. But yeah, so the map, sometimes needs additional explanation. In geospatial, I know if I'm looking at a legend, or if I share this map with you or another folk in geospatial, I know that they're going to look at the legend and try to decipher it through that. But a lot of our audience at Carto aren't geospatial experts per se. They might be data science experts or business intelligence experts. Uh, but what we can do in Carto is use markdown language, which is just, text-based. In geospatial, we know to look at a legend like this map legend in the bottom right corner, and try to interpret the map through that lens. That's actually a bit of technical jargon. Most people in business intelligence and other disciplines don't necessarily go to the legend. In fact, I've had arguments with people in marketing about the legend often in previous roles that I've had. And so what I like at Carto is our ability to use markdown language to tell the story of the map, not one word, because that would be a competitor's product, and 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 really draw attention to what we want the user to understand from the map. So in this case, and you had asked the question, what does it mean to see the yellows and reds and blues on this map? Um, well, keep in mind we've already filtered the blues out of this map. Those blue areas are areas that already have strong network access. So they're the good areas, so to speak. I intentionally didn't use green because there's a lot of red-green color blindness in the U.S., and I think I even have some of it. So it is easier for me to see the difference between blue and red. And those blue areas are areas, if you're a telco provider, that either you're already providing good service there or somebody else is, and you're not going to get a lot out of existing funding programs to go there and build additional infrastructure. The red, which is the area we want to draw attention to, indicates critical broadband expansion needs for this particular target population, which are senior citizens in the U.S. And so, all sort of nuance and context aside about why that particular population would be important to focus on. The purpose of this map is to demonstrate how you can take a massive data set across the United States, drill down to the target audience you want to focus on, and look at how those areas of opportunity, as I would frame it, align with different funding resources.
So is there like a state by state telecoms improvement funding programs that this map could be used to help local, like from the governor down to the local county leader, make decisions about which areas to mention in such a funding application? Is it for local citizens? Could the public use this map to prompt their leaders to access that funding?
That's a really good way to look at this, right? Is I frame this as a telco tool, but the same information has relevance in the public sector. It has relevance for local community organizers, and different nonprofits who might have an interest in issues of accessibility for their constituents. This could absolutely be used by those uh, by a range of different people and organizations. And one of the reasons it could actually be used is a lot of this is all public data that we're using to form these insights. And so, um, you know, right now, this is a public resource, and I'll be writing about what you can do with it. I appreciate the feedback, and how it could be used in the public sector is definitely something worth exploring. Yeah,
I mean,
and thanks for that.
there's you could add time to this. It would be fascinating to see an animation over time of how this telco access changes, and to see the interaction with socioeconomic status of communities. I'm more familiar, at least in terms of the name, from the UK. There's a indices of deprivation map. There's one
Mm.
from 2015. There's one from 2019. I think there's one from last year as well. And it's interesting to see how the colors indicating deprivation really change over time across the UK. Is there a similar nationwide analysis of socioeconomic status in the US?
There is. So we're talking at an interesting time in the US when it comes to federally available data sets that adjudicate
Right.
social and
They're dropping
environmental
by the day.
issues. They are, but many of them are backed up by different organizations, and much of the methodology for how to calculate those indices is out there, and it is part of the general sort of academic community, because again, no model will perfectly describe the population. But certainly in the US, the EJ screen, for example, is a very prominent example of indices that take into account socioeconomic status, geospatial conditions such as the proximity to landfills and other hazards and things like that, or Superfund sites.
Yeah, there's one called Area Deprivation Index. We were just in Georgia, so it's called the Neighborhood Atlas,
Mm.
neighborhoodatlas.medicine.wisc.edu. So if we go to Georgia, this is a state-only deciles, and then if we go to national percentages, it changes a
Mm.
bit. So in terms of a national level, most of Georgia appears to be quite deprived, with more fortunate folks living in Atlanta, especially
Mm.
to the north of Atlanta. Anyway, I don't mean to.
No, no, and I think to your point, right, there's a plethora of information out there that gets at issues of accessibility, health impacts, social impacts, economic, environmental impacts. A lot of that data is out there and can be used in a number of ways. One of the ways that Carto tends to position those data sets is they are out there and you should be using them to enrich your you know portfolio of buildings to see which of your buildings are at risk, or you have a customer data set and you'd like to know the prevalence of certain diseases, so you might um, use CDC's places data set to do that. And in the past, a lot of those analyses happen ad hoc and on a desktop GIS in a silo where the insights they produce you know happen in that desktop machine way over there. Somebody who needs to make a decision based on the result is in a completely different part of the organization. And the Carto way of doing those analyses is no, we can hold all of those data and indices in one place. We can hold your personal information or customer information or asset information in a secure place. And you can do those analytics together again and again, or over time, or at scale in different ways. And so I think if anything, it's a very exciting time for geospatial in that regard, right? We aren't necessarily being as walled off as we used to be, and the value of these data products are being quote unquote this is a buzzword, but they're being democratized for other types of analysts and decision makers. um, what's in the political reality is just like a fascinating inversion of that. At the same time, we have unprecedented access to these information sets, and processing power to look at them, and then we have a world right now where you know the future of some of
Unfortunately,
those data sets the future of those data sets is a little bit precarious, and
yeah, I'm
it'll be
almost sick.
interesting to see how the 2030 census comes along. Fingers crossed. I don't know if you have talked to anyone working on it or not, but
No, I'd love to.
that's going to be a key area we all need to be thinking about now, not in not in 5 years from now, but now's the important time for all of that work to be set up.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it would be. Yeah. I mean, I almost felt like in the first couple of weeks of the latest presidential term, it was almost every day or two on Blue Sky and LinkedIn that people were mentioning certain, what can I say, data sets you would expect to be commonly available, and there will be no controversy to do with them from the federal government, which were being retired. And then there's also been, court cases that, forcing the government to reinstate some of them. So it's interesting to observe. And yeah.
Yeah, and I know it's late to say it, but these are obviously all my personal views on the matter. But I will also say that some of those data sets that came down are back up, right?
Right.
And so, the precarity of it is an issue, though. And if you're a data scientist or a data engineer and you have a pipeline,
Yeah.
and one week you're pulling in census data or roads from the Tiger lines, and they go away, and then the next week they come back. It's great they came back, but how did that disrupt your week's worth of data that you might have been enriching it against something of a timely essence or timely nature?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. There's commercial implications for this and customer complaints to deal with. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think you've given us a good insight into what a solutions engineer does at Carto. So thanks for that dashboard,
Of course.
Gideon. I thought I usually don't get autobiographical in these episodes, but I just as an indication of the value of Carto over the years for myself, I wanted to show, if I can, what I had done. Here we go. So, and maybe this is something that we can return to in future episodes. But I guess as come up in the conversations I've had with over a few episodes, I have had there's good and bad to the career I've had. It's gone across I'm in the sixth country so far, and inevitably I've collected a few interesting data sets and come up against some interesting, controversial, difficult, even tragic issues along the way. I guess given that the countries I've been to. So one of them was this bombing data set for the entire Vietnam War from the US. It was released after a campaign to, I guess, a Freedom of Information Act campaign to get the coordinates of bombing sorties. It shows that not only were these bombs dropped on Vietnam, but also into Cambodia and Laos. You can see we're at 1969 at the moment. So there's a fair amount of intensity in Laos and across the border along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia there. Anyway, so that was one. Just to say that over my career, it's interesting to see how I've just turned to Carto when I've gotten one of these data sets and want to sort of store it and maybe quickly sort of analyze what's going on. Another one was this actually former New York Times bureau chief. I think when his name was Stephen Kinzer, when he was this bureau chief in Istanbul, his eyes were opened really to the impact of US foreign policy and the use of the US military to further the interests of especially multinational companies and sometimes allies of the US around the world. And he wrote a book called Overthrow about 14 countries that, the US government had overthrown. So I used Carto for that. And then another one, if I can get my screen sharing thing out of the way, was this map that I already mentioned in the episode with Henk van Houten, this author of a book called Free the Map, which was from my time in the Middle East. Up here, where I'm waving my cursor, which shows the so-called kafala states. Kafala is a a system of managing foreign workers that was actually set up by British colonists who've since left. But this practice of, in a way, really holding people from overseas, especially from poorer countries in indentured servitude persists in these kafala states. And this map, using Carto again, an older version, shows where countries from which these workers go to the kafala states have banned their workers going there due to persistent abuse of these people once they arrive, especially as domestic and construction workers. So yeah, I just wanted to say that, you know, as someone from the outside world, outside of Carto, who didn't really have a personal connection with you guys, just to show how you have the organization and the tools have benefited us. So yeah, I just wanted to share that.
I think all those maps you showed are powerful examples of the types of insights you can get at that sort of global country level, which help guide lines of questioning. And so my background is really as a mixed methods researcher first and foremost. I'm trained as an anthropologist who went at the geospatial. And when I see data like that, to me that it's an appetizer, right? It's, hey, there's something interesting going on here. What is the ethnographic present or reality of those folks who are experiencing that in the past, or even what kind of effect or affect is that data having on people who live in those regions today? For some of the historical data you showed, for example, one of the things that really stood out to me was, and I don't know if this is a product of the time animation tool or the data itself, but there are those eerie moments of silence in the time animation showing the bombing stopping during particular moments, like a sort of breath before the next attack.
Right.
And that is, you know, for me, just seeing that is evocative of some really
Right.
intense feelings, let alone folks who experienced or were directly, you know, affected by the historical event itself. And the anthropologist in me gets at least very enthusiastically interested in what those stories are. And there's questions of power and who should be asking those questions and who should be writing about those things, which are also important questions. But I think, you know, in many ways, spatial data should never be taken as a standalone sort of, this is a view of the world and it explains everything. It needs that context, it needs those stories, it needs those experiences to really help understand, well, you know, why, you know, just taking this back to the other dashboard that I had built, like, what is the experience of not having connectivity to the internet if you're living in rural Georgia? What does that mean today? And does it matter? Should we put money towards it? And, you know, who are we trying to benefit? Those questions can't be answered by geospatial alone, but geospatial can discipline and structure that conversation around need, and accessibility.
Yep. Yeah. I also want to say something to emphasize, I guess, is in the point you're making about the utility of Carto, is that it's a tool perhaps that people without a master's in geospatial can drive. And this speaks to again, to acknowledge that this is a cliche term, but speaks to the democratization that's happening in the industry, where more people can get a robust understanding of where things are happening.
Mm.
Okay, good. Yes, it's really interesting for me, and this is all totally unintentional, but it's really interesting to observe this pattern that Carto is enabling these conversations around culture and power dimensions via a compelling cloud-based geospatial tool. Moving on then to the last item, I'd like to dig into how an anthropologist applies geospatial. So you have actually published in the wonderfully named area of digital garbology. What strategies have you recommended for confronting uneven and often unjust distributions of e-waste onto marginalized communities, to use your own words in your publication?
Fair enough. So yeah, electronic waste is something I've spent about 5 to 10 years of my life in different ways. I mean, I know that's a range, but there are times when I was really focused on it, and times when I was working in geospatial at the same time. But yeah, I think as an anthropologist working on a team of engineers focused on electronic waste, one of the things that I had to do was build a theoretical model of what electronic waste even is. And so to understand who's sort of which marginal communities are affected by it, you have to define the thing. And defining the thing in terms of how the government, for example, defines it as, I have a phone or a computer and I'm ready to upgrade and I just want to throw it away. If that's how you understand electronic waste, then the implications are around mapping where do people work with electronic waste to take them apart, recycle them, where are people living in or nearby landfills where those materials are being burned or leached into the earth and affecting everything from you know our bodies on the inside to the whole ecosystem around it. There are massive implications for how electronic waste is managed. Um, but the anthropologist's approach to it and this sort of digital garbology approach to it is to take digital seriously in two ways. One is anything that's digital could become waste. And so if you think about it that way, and it expands waste from consumer electronics to all of the resources that go into a data center that power things like Netflix or whatever streaming service you're using to, you know, all of the junk emails that you have piling up in your inbox, which actually take up physical storage somewhere on Earth. If you think about all of that as a potential source of e-waste, then how you grapple with the sort of the margins and edges of who could be possibly affected by it changes. And what I found a lot in interviewing folks is some people were just as quick to show me their junk drawer full of electronics as they were just to talk to me about how much time they wasted on the internet scrolling through Instagram or waiting for the next video to load and things like that. And when you hear those things as sort of a government person focused on e-waste in a policy regard, your first instinct is to discipline that out and say all that stuff like, yeah, it's interesting, but it's not important. I want to manage the e-waste stream. I want to manage consumer electronics. But in doing so, you block yourself off from the reality that there are all these systems in place that produce waste, produce um, environmental impacts, social impacts on people who are at a disadvantage or people who are, at risk of being moved off their lands because an international organization comes in and says, you can't recycle these electronics unless you do it our way because the way you're doing it is unsafe, which is true, right? There's a lot of unsafe, informal e-waste recycling practices, but the folks who engage in them for reasons that are part of the wider global system. And to, so you get into issues of agency and issues of, okay, we're trying to do good, but are we actively including the people who are extracting value from our waste in the process of rehabilitation, so to speak? Or are we?
But that brings up actually the same map that I was showing before about
Ah,
where citizens are banned from. I'm going to bring it up again. So one of the countries on the map is Pakistan, and then, but actually over on the other side of India, there's Bangladesh. Because I think, and I only have like a total amateurs outsiders understanding of this, but at least from what I hear from the news, there's a lot of e-waste recycling that happens here, along with actually. Um, so this is I guess, an illustration how the patterns being discussed, or two issues being discussed: mistreatment of migrant workers, and also ways perhaps in which e-waste processing could be done in a way that's less harmful. Those patterns are perhaps occurring in the same country. And you were speaking
Mm.
about agency there. There's a lot to dig into here.
Oh, probably its own episode or several episodes worth of things that we could talk about. But one of the ways to bring e-waste, at least back to geospatial and digital garbology to spatial, certainly is researchers. In fact, there are a few Canadian researchers, Josh Lepowski to name one, who focus on the transboundary movement of electronic waste and tracking it across different countries and looking at where the stuff ends up. A lot of the work focused on who ends up working with it tends to be more ethnographic in nature. So people, anthropologists who either are of nearby communities or go to those communities and embed themselves there for 6 months of field work, a year of field work, and so on, and really start to piece together the stories of why did people end up working in those places, what what affordances does working in those places have for them, and how are they being impacted by the data? How are they being impacted by international organizations who see those maps, who make policy decisions top down based on those maps or ban certain things from happening? And I think a lot of the discourse around e-waste, for example, is focused on whether bans actually help. Um, and I think my stance on a lot of those things is a lot of sort of absolutionist positions where an all-in ban or nothing. Those types of ultimatums never work because they never deal with the nuance or causes for what would lead to somebody wanting to migrate to work in an informal e-waste recycling facility. Those stories are, there are patterns in those stories for sure, but there's also incredible, nuance and specificity that geospatial alone can't get to.
So is there? You mentioned it. It was an interesting sentence that people might migrate to an informal e-waste processing facility. So that I think is a concept that a lot of people would never have crossed many people's minds. I guess in a similar vein, at least in terms of spatial distribution, is there any sort of a map which shows, the top countries for processing e-waste that's been imported from other countries? Is there sort of like an e-waste flow map? Does that
Mm-hmm.
factor into any of those
Um,
investigations?
I am definitely not as up to date on it as I wish I was. But these transboundary maps of electronic waste and e-waste movement, they get at e-waste in the flow of it nationally from that regard. And there's also um, different watchdogs and folks involved in the Basel Convention that track the movement of hazardous waste across countries. And so there are these sort of large scale numbers and maps that look at these things in aggregate. But one of the things that I think, taking the digital garbology part of it back into consideration is there's a lot of trash data about trash. And notoriously waste and things that people have decided aren't valuable are difficult to track because they go through this stage of liminality where they're sort of neither here nor there, spatially or economically. And it's only when they're commoditized again that we start tracking them. And so it can be very difficult to really wrap our heads around just how much waste is in a particular place at any given time on Earth. Um, so a lot of our information and a lot of our models and predictions about how much e-waste is out there are driven by consumption models, like how much stuff are people buying, for example. Or if you look at a government refurbishment program where they're refreshing their entire tech stack, we have those numbers, right? Because they sort of fit within a specified purchasing model. But for the consumer electronics, I'm sure almost every estimate we've seen is probably massively underestimated.
That's fascinating. So there are efforts, you're saying, to predict the amount of waste based on how much has been consumed and reasonable assumptions about packaging and the disposable bits around, and then even the
Uh,
lifetime use of the thing that was consumed, which eventually becomes waste itself anyway.
mm, which brings us sort of full circle back to Adelaide. I spent time in
Many
Adelaide and
people
Alice
have referred
Springs.
to Adelaide as trash.
No, that's not what I'm saying. Actually, what I'm saying is Adelaide and South Australia in terms of their leadership in managing waste. Dating back to the 1970s, South Australia is the first to have container deposit legislation to, their role in monitoring illegal dumping and things like that. It's now, I believe it's called the Office of Green Industry South Australia, previously Zero Waste South Australia. I got to meet a lot of those folks while I was over there, and my research was focused on the National Television and Computer Recycling Scheme, and all the numbers for those schemes were really more generated by data on consumption, data on how much was being sold, because the quotas for how many electronics needed to be recycled, um, set by and agreed upon by this sort of consortium of the private sector and a little bit of the public sector, which is I critique that a little bit in my dissertation. Um, but needless to say, those numbers that we're talking about, the maps of how much computer and television product gets recycled, those are all sort of driven within this consumption framework, not necessarily an accurate read of how much material is out there and reusable. And so, the engines that drive a lot of the mapping and data analytics around waste begin with consumption, for better or for worse. But it's a partially a data availability bias as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I would hazard a guess that if you did a global map of data availability, just we were talking about the census, for example, how
Mm,
accessible census data is per country around the world, that would offer interesting insight. How far you
mm,
could get in a day in a nationwide analysis of some variable. That would actually be an interesting exercise, actually, to compare how easy data science is per jurisdiction. Anyway, I think that I was trying to sort of think how we could sum up this conversation because we have just covered so many things. We started talking about
mm,
accessibility of telecommunications and how fast internet speeds are in a certain part of Georgia.
mhm,
um, we've talked about my travels around the world and the small spatial analyses on a larger scale that's led to. Um, we've talked about trash and digital garbology everywhere from, or at least global flows of e-waste, but then focusing in on drilling down to Adelaide in South Australia. I again, I'll say again, this is another way to illustrate how interesting the role of solutions engineer at Carto must be. It also illustrates how Carto can facilitate understanding on so many scales against so many problems.
mm,
This is also a nice advert, generally speaking, for the geospatial industry. I should also flag that it was good to cover spatial indexes too, which I know from the social media output of Helen McKenzie. This is
mm.
a common thing that comes up in what comes from Carto. So yeah, for me, it's been a great episode, Gideon, for going over all of those things, and I hope setting us up for some more conversations. For example, to dig into an animation of these bombing sorties as part of the Vietnam War, and as another illustration, perhaps, of what Carto can do in a spatio-temporal sense. And I also want to flag after this meeting you're having tomorrow with your boss, digging into what Parquet files are and how they've changed recently.
Oh yeah, lots of exciting stuff coming.
All right, cool. So hopefully that means you'll pay attention quite strongly to that training call with
Yeah.
Javier.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It was a real pleasure to talk trash with you and talk maps with you.
Likewise, and also to talk about where I'm from, South Australia. So good stuff.